Ever wonder how an empire could rule through pure terror? Let's talk about the Assyrians, a civilization that turned fear into a weapon of mass control. Their kings didn't just conquer lands, they made entire populations tremble with brutal tactics, like impaling enemies and stacking heads as warnings. Imagine living in a city where rebellion meant your family's deportation or worse. Stick around, because we're uncovering how they built an empire on psychological warfare, with chilling examples straight from their own records. You'll see why their terror machine still haunts history today. What if an empire could control millions just by making them too scared to fight back? Let's talk about how the Assyrians climbed to power with fear as their foundation. These guys didn't mess around, and their rise in the ancient world is a story of raw power mixed with some seriously dark methods. You wouldn't believe how they turned terror into their biggest strength. But first, let's set the scene for how they got started. Picture Mesopotamia around 900 BCE, a total mess of tiny states and warring tribes all fighting over scraps of land. It was like a giant free-for-all, with no one strong enough to take charge. That's where the Assyrians saw their chance. Coming from their heartland in what's now northern Iraq, they looked at this chaos and thought, we can own this. And they didn't just want to win battles, they wanted to make sure no one ever dared to stand against them. It was the perfect storm for a ruthless power to step in and take everything. Now here's the tension. The Assyrians didn't just fight wars for land or gold. They turned conquest into something bigger, almost like a sacred job. They claimed their god, Assur, gave them a clear order: dominate everyone or else. This wasn't just politics to them. It was a divine mission straight from the heavens. Every city they crushed, every tribe they broke, was supposedly for a higher purpose. Imagine believing your every act of violence was blessed by a god. That's the mindset they carried into every fight. Let's break it down a bit more. Their kings, like Sargon II, put together massive armies, some of the biggest the world had seen at that time. These weren't small raiding parties. They were organized war machines that steamrolled over neighbors with terrifying speed. Their plan was simple but brutal. Hit hard and fast, crushing any hint of resistance before it could even grow into a real threat. They didn't give people time to think about fighting back. One minute you're tending your fields, the next, an Assyrian army is at your gates, ready to wipe your village off the map. Historical records from their own writings show how proud they were of this destruction. They bragged about emptying entire regions, taking every last bit of grain, livestock, and wealth, leaving nothing but fear behind. Imagine your town being stripped bare, not just of stuff, but of hope. They wrote about it like it was a great achievement, a sign of their unstoppable might. It wasn't enough to win. They had to make sure you felt the loss in your bones. Think of it as the ancient version of a hostile takeover. Except, instead of buying out a company with money, they're taking lives and land with pure, brutal efficiency. There's no negotiation, no mercy, just a clear message that you either bow down or get crushed. Their own royal inscriptions paint this picture even darker. They saw themselves as agents of cosmic order, like they were fixing the world by breaking people. Every horrific act, no matter how cruel, was just part of keeping the universe in balance, at least in their eyes. So, here's the big question. How did they make sure no one dared to rebel? Their secret wasn't just having a strong army. It was something way darker. Here's the kicker. They mastered psychological warfare, using calculated fear to lock down entire regions. We'll get into the gritty details soon. So, stick with me to see how they turned terror into their sharpest tool for building an empire. Ever imagine living in a world where punishment isn't hidden but displayed for all to see? Let's talk about the Assyrian habit of turning torture into a public spectacle. You wouldn't believe how they took cruelty to a whole new level, making sure everyone in their empire got the message loud and clear. This wasn't just about winning wars. It was about planting fear so deep that no one would even dream of stepping out of line. Stick with me, because the details are as grim as they are fascinating. Once they conquered a city, the Assyrians didn't just stop at victory. They made sure everyone knew the cost of defiance, with a show of pure horror. After taking a town, they didn't quietly deal with prisoners behind closed doors. Nope, they turned punishment into a public event, something everyone had to witness, whether they wanted to or not. The goal wasn't just to hurt a few people, it was to scare thousands into submission by showing what happens when you cross them. Imagine being forced to watch, knowing that could be you next. Their methods were gruesome, designed not just to inflict pain, but to break spirits and send a loud message to anyone watching. We're talking about stuff that would make your stomach turn. Picture this. Their own royal carvings and texts describe impaling enemies on stakes right outside city walls. They left those bodies there, rotting in the open, as a constant warning to anyone passing by. It wasn't enough to kill. They had to make sure the image stuck in your mind forever. That's the kind of terror they wanted to spread. Their palace reliefs give us even more chilling details. These stone carvings show scenes of eye gouging and decapitations, often done right in front of huge crowds to ramp up the horror. They didn't hide this stuff. They put it on display like a twisted form of entertainment. It's like the ancient version of a viral video, except instead of getting laughs, it's pure dread spreading through every village and town. You can bet people talked about it for miles, making sure the fear reached far beyond the city gates. Historical accounts from their records mention kings going even further after battles. They'd pile up the heads of defeated enemies, creating literal mounds of terror to haunt survivors. Think about walking past a stack of human heads every day on your way to the market. That's not something you forget. They even hung skins of flayed prisoners on city walls in places like Nineveh, just to hammer home their dominance. Talk about a message you can't ignore. But why go to such extremes? There's a cold logic behind this cruelty that made it terrifyingly effective. The Assyrians weren't just randomly violent. They planned every act to maximize fear. Public torture wasn't about personal revenge. It was about control. By making examples out of a few, they scared everyone else into behaving. They used heralds to warn cities before attacks, describing the horrors waiting if they resisted. It was psychological warfare at its darkest, breaking people before a single soldier even arrived. The real takeaway here is that they used torture as propaganda, ensuring entire populations lived in fear of even thinking about rebellion. You wouldn't dare whisper a word against them with those images burned into your mind. They turned terror into their most effective weapon of war, and it worked terrifyingly well. Now, let's shift to how they took this fear even further by tearing communities apart in a different way. What if your entire life could be uprooted just to make you powerless? Let's talk about how the Assyrians used mass deportations to shatter whole societies. You wouldn't believe the lengths they went to, not just to win battles, but to make sure no one could ever stand up to them again. This wasn't about swords or torture alone. It was about taking away everything that made a community strong, leaving people lost and broken. Stick with me, because this tactic was as cold as it was effective. Conquering a place was one thing for the Assyrians, but they wanted a permanent grip on power. After rolling over a city with their armies, they didn't trust the locals to stay quiet. They knew that people with shared history and family ties could plot and fight back. So, they came up with a plan to stop any chance of that happening. It wasn't enough to scare folks with public punishments. They needed to rip apart the very roots of who these people were. Imagine your whole world being torn away, not just by force, but by design. Here's where it gets grim. Their solution wasn't just about taking lives. It was about erasing cultural ties by forcing entire populations to move far from home. Think about it. After a city fell, thousands of people, men, women, kids, were marched hundreds of miles away. They got split from their families, their friends, everything they knew, and dumped into strange lands with nothing familiar. The conditions were awful, with little food or rest on these long treks, and many didn't even survive the journey. It was a brutal way to strip people of hope. Historical texts from their own records show they did this on purpose, mixing different groups together so no single culture could stick tight. Under rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, who was a master at this game from 745 to 727 BCE, they'd take folks from one conquered area and swap them with others from a totally different region. The goal was to mess up any sense of belonging. You're surrounded by strangers, speaking different tongues, with no shared past to lean on. Talk about a way to kill off any chance of working together against the empire. It's like the ancient version of shuffling a deck of cards, except the cards are human lives, reshuffled to destroy any sense of unity. They even targeted specific people for this nightmare. Records tell us they relocated skilled workers, like builders or craftsmen, straight to Assyrian cities to work on big projects. They forced these folks to help make the empire stronger, while the ones left behind couldn't do much without their key people. Rebellion? That became a distant memory when half your town was gone, slaving away somewhere else. But wait, there's a hidden layer to this strategy that shows just how calculated their control really was. They didn't just pick random people to move. They used deportation to scare vassal states and smaller kingdoms into staying loyal. The threat of losing everything, your home, your family, your entire way of life, hung over everyone's head. It wasn't just leaders at risk. It was every single person. That kind of fear made even the bravest think twice before raising a fist. The big reveal here is that they didn't just move people. They weaponized displacement to kill off any chance of resistance or identity. You're not just homeless. You're no one. They turned whole communities into tools for the empire, with no fight left in them. Next, let's see how they locked in this control with something beyond physical cruelty. Ever think a god could be scarier than an army? Let's talk about how the Assyrians used religion to tighten their grip on conquered lands. You wouldn't believe how they took control to a whole new level, not just with weapons or force marches, but by messing with people's beliefs. They made fear a spiritual thing, tying it to the idea of divine anger. Stick with me, because this tactic was as clever as it was creepy, and it shows just how far they'd go to keep power. Beyond swords and stakes, the Assyrians had another weapon up their sleeve, convincing people their brutality was backed by divine will. It wasn't enough to win on the battlefield or move folks hundreds of miles from home. They wanted everyone to think their harsh rule came straight from the heavens, like they had a godly stamp of approval for every cruel act. If you're told the gods themselves are behind your suffering, how do you even fight that? They turned faith into a chain, locking people in place without ever lifting a spear. Here's where the tension kicks in. They didn't just demand obedience. They forced entire populations to worship Assyrian gods as a clear sign of submission. Imagine being told that resisting the empire meant angering a deity who'd punish you for eternity, not just in this life. Forget about risking a battle or a public punishment. Now your soul is on the line. That's a whole different kind of fear, one that hits deeper than any physical threat they could dream up. You're not just scared for yourself. You're scared for what comes after. Their own records show how serious this was. Vassal treaties, those deals they made with local leaders, often had rules requiring these rulers to honor Assur, the chief Assyrian god, above their own beliefs. It wasn't a choice, it was a must. If you broke that promise, they'd claim divine curses would fall on you. It's like the ancient version of signing a contract under duress, except this contract ties your soul to a foreign power. You're stuck, and the price of breaking free feels way too high for most to even try. Historical evidence paints an even clearer picture. The Assyrians built temples in conquered areas, not just to show off, but to enforce this spiritual dominance. They'd tear down local holy sites, or ignore them completely, pushing their own gods instead, trying to erase old faiths. Talk about a takeover of the mind. They weren't just after land. They wanted your prayers too. In new provinces, they'd force people to make offerings to Assyrian deities, leaving no room for old traditions. It was a slow grind to wipe out what folks held dear. They even took sacred statues from conquered cities, a practice called godnapping, to break people's spirits. These weren't just objects. Folks saw them as real links to their gods. Taking them away was like saying, your protectors are gone, and they couldn't save you. They spread messages that these deities had abandoned the locals due to their failures or sins. You're left feeling hopeless, surrounded by propaganda about Assur's power. But what's the real impact of blending faith with fear in such a planned way? Here's the chilling truth. They made rebellion feel like a sin, locking people into obedience through spiritual terror. You wouldn't dare resist when it felt like defying a god. Now, let's wrap up with how this legacy of fear shaped history long after their empire fell. So, the Assyrians didn't just build an empire. They crafted a terror machine that still echoes in how we understand power and control today. Their brutal tactics, from torture to forced moves, set a dark standard for ruling through fear. You wouldn't believe how later empires, like the Mongols, copied these ideas, even building pyramids of heads to scare folks into line. What do you think? Could a society built on fear ever truly last? Drop your thoughts below, and check out our other videos on history's darkest chapters. Let's keep uncovering the past together. You'll be shocked at what's next.